Welcome back to the Centre for Policy Studies Going for Growth conference. I'm Robert Colvile, the Director of the Centre for Policy Studies, and I've now stepped out of my panellist chair from the last session on housing to my interviewee chair for what we were billing as a fireside chat, although there don't seem to be many firesides around, with Sajid Javid, the former Chancellor. Sajid is not just a friend of the CPS, but in many ways the inspiration for this conference. This paper, published a few weeks ago with him, which we worked on for several months, he and the team here at the CPS, was intended as both a reminder that that growth and recovery were the big thing coming out of this conference. Coming out of this crisis, but also containing sort of practical suggestions for how to get there. So, Sajid, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll get on to questions from the audience in a bit. But I just wanted to ask, when we first started talking about this, you were relatively optimistic about a V-shaped recovery. Then you went much more towards a U-shape. Today we've had ONS figures showing that the 6 points, we fell 20%, we're now back, it's roughly about half of that. How do you feel, compared with a few months ago, that the pace of recovery is going?
No, thanks. First of all, it's good to be here, and thanks for all the work that you've done with me in looking at the recovery, see what we can all do, what more we can do together. In terms of where we are, I think compared to some of those figures we were hearing not that long ago about 20% fall in GDP, 25% and all that, it's good to see positive results in terms of growth going up. The numbers today I thought were encouraging, but as Rishi himself has recognised today as well, there's still a long way to go. So we seem to be sort of heading in the right direction, but like before, it depends so much still on how we handle the pandemic, the social distancing rules, the rules for businesses. So I think, and I can see why for others, that people feel there's a lot of uncertainty still out there.
And I mean, obviously, before we get on to the economics, we've seen in this week alone a tightening of social distancing rules. I mean, is that something that and many people, including people who've been making themselves known in the comments on this conference, have been saying, look, we're going too tight. We're throttling the economy in our efforts to protect people from the virus. I mean, where do you sit on that?
I think first, given this virus was new for all of us, and no government in the world had faced anything like this, so we've sort of been learning by doing, and I think there is an acceptance now in government that that you must go to a great extent to protect the economy, to try and sort of limit that damage. That said, in terms of the recent decision about the limiting to 6, look, I'm not in the room. He's not anymore. I'm not in the room. I don't see what the scientists are saying myself, so I hesitate to sort of give a second opinion from the backbenches without knowing all the information. But I can understand the calls from others to sort of say, look, do children, for example, really need to be included in that? And I think that, I hope that the government is constantly reviewing this and not afraid to make a change if that's necessary.
Yes, because obviously it's not just about there's this balance between economic confidence and people being safe to go out. I know we were talking in the green room, I think as parents, it would be nice for children not to be counted in these in these.
I've got a family of 6, so we're not going to have any visitors for a while.
Yeah, but in terms of the recovery, I mean, what do you think? I mean, if you're Rishi sitting in the Treasury, what are you thinking are the priorities? What are the sort of the key drivers and the most important challenges that you're facing?
First, excuse me, I'd say Rishi's done a great job so far. I'm very proud of him, and I think that for any chancellor this would have been the most difficult of circumstances. And when the government decides they're going to lock down and stop people from consuming and producers from producing, of course there's going to be a massive economic hit. And the first sort of set of policies he's had, the sort of policies on whether it's furlough and COVID loans and things, is all about sort of putting the economy to hibernation, so to speak. And now I know that he and his team will be very focused on recovery. So you asked me what kind of things should be focused on. As I sort of try to set out in that report, the very first thing I'd say actually is let's start with the principles of growth, right? Because growth is the only thing that's going to get us out of this. And I remember very vividly in that general election, which wasn't that long ago, that I went around, the Prime Minister and others quite rightly saying that the only way we can pay for fantastic public services is to have a dynamic, free enterprise economy. Now, COVID will change a lot of things, but one thing it will not change is how you create wealth in an economy, create jobs and pay for those public services. So in anything that we do, everything that we do, I think we just have to be committed to those core principles of your free enterprise, of low taxes, of sensible regulation, free trade, and sound public finances. So I just would put those principles as sort of overarching any action that is taken. Then beyond that, you're getting into sort of the more specifics. I think that, for example, the investment in infrastructure is now even more important than it was before. Before COVID, I talked about the infrastructure revolution. I think there's actually an argument to even go further, even more than the increases I'd wanted to do. You can take advantage of the record low interest rates, and I think it's okay to do that.
And very certainly front load that spending.
Yeah, and focus a lot on the delivery as well. As a country under successive governments, I think we've been pretty lousy in delivering on infrastructure commitments. There's lots of reasons for that, but there are lots of ways also we can improve that and make sure when we make a commitment on infrastructure, that will actually get delivered on time and on budget with things like the infrastructure, the commission, the delivery authority, perhaps making a few changes there, giving ministers specific responsibility for particular projects. So infrastructure is a big part of this. The economic infrastructure in particular, the roads, the bridges, the broadband, rail, and all of those that have an economic, particularly longer term economic impact. Other areas, and I won't, I'll just mention them for now. If you want me to expand on them, very happy to do that. On terms of taxes, I think there's actually a case for some temporary tax decreases. Employment, we know, is going to be a problem. We know there's an employment tax out there, the employer's national insurance. And it's a necessary tax. Government's got to raise the revenue, but there's an argument to, for example, have a temporary cut in that, maybe for a couple of years to try and give that extra incentive for employers to get out there and take on more people. I think there's a case for much more of a supply side revolution, and by that, deregulation in planning, for example. The government set out some decent plans recently, but we should go further. What about a lot more development corporations, especially in some of the harder hit areas around the country, and both for housing, but also for commercial development. And then the public finances. Obviously, we maybe talk a bit more. I know it's much easier said than done, but the government does need to send out a strong signal that they will be brought back under control, that they've got a pathway to do that, so that we can start living within our means again.
Well, an enormous amount to go on there. But let's start on that last point. So there have been reports that Rishi Sunak is considering about 30 billion of tax rise, 30 billion of tax rises in the forthcoming budget, including a 5-point, well, technically a 5-point, maybe actually a 3-point rise in corporation tax, and raising CGT to the level of income tax. So what do you think about A, the timing of that idea, and B, the specifics that they're talking about there?
I think first on the more broadly on taxes, it's just worth remembering we already, before sort of pre-pandemic, had the highest level, highest tax burden, let's say, that we've had in 4 decades, and so we're already, I think, highly taxed. And in normal times, Conservative Chancellor obviously will be looking at ways to cut taxes, like we promised, for example, in our manifesto on employees' national insurance. But obviously, this crisis has meant that there needs to be a fresh look at those plans. I would just be, and I think the Treasury will be actually, in reality, very hesitant to want to raise taxes, especially those that could derail a recovery. I think there's a real risk if you went with some tax increases now in the short term, it will derail the recovery. So I would hold off on any of that. And I certainly wouldn't want to see any increased taxes that would hit businesses, those SMEs, entrepreneurs, the wealth creators, because we need to encourage those risk takers if we're going to have the kind of recovery we want to see.
So, I mean, so George Osborne spoke in a previous session on this conference, and he said he would be urging Boris, although he accepted it, it's not quite that much in Boris's nature, to look at expenditure cuts, probably not on the scale of that you and he worked on together in 2010, but that there is, that should be an area to look at. Is that something that you'd agree with?
We have to deal with the reality that we face. We're understandably right now, because of the crisis, largely we're spending a lot more money. We're running this record deficit. Everyone knows that's not sustainable. We don't have a reserve currency like the US, and so we just don't have that kind of ability to sustain a long-term, big deficit. So we're going to have to bring finances under control one way or the other, whether we like it or not. And we either can choose to do it proactively ourselves and that way have a stronger recovery, or eventually we'll get forced to deal with some future crisis. So the way to do this is to recognize that you are going to have to make sure that ultimately you set out a plan that your spending is consistent with what you aim to raise in taxes. And I think we historically raised recently, I think, something like 40% in taxes. I mean, that's a lot of money. There's a huge amount of money for the paid public services. What I hope is going to happen, and the signs of this is that Rishi's going ahead rightly with the comprehensive spending review. So this year, we're not just going to have the budget, but we're going to have the comprehensive spending review, the one I had to delay for various reasons, no deal preparations and stuff.
Would you still be doing a multi-year spending review in this situation, even though you don't know what taxes are or what spending is going to be?
It's a good question. I think that there's definitely a strong argument to do what you would Treasury calls a spending round. So for a single year, like I did back in, I think, November last year. In that case, it was because of no deal was the priority. There was a potential election around the corner, and you could certainly, if you wanted to postpone some of the, say, tougher decisions, you could justify a one-year round. But at the moment, the government is committed to a multi-year spending review, and I think that spending review should be what's called a zero-based review. That you look at every program in every department and you get that Secretary of State to justify that in the context of what the government's priorities are. Because not everything can be a priority. And clearly our priorities are getting out of this pandemic with a stronger economy, recovering, creating jobs, and leveling up. And I think you can look at all those programs again. And what I can tell you, from my own experience, once I had my first cabinet job, and obviously that was new and trying to work out how to be a good Secretary of State, once I got into the swing of things, I had my next job in the business department and every subsequent department I've run. One of the first things I asked for in the very first week was to say to my permanent secretary, I want a list on a spreadsheet with every single program this department is doing, how many full-time equivalent people are on it, how much have you spent, what's its purpose, who commissioned it. That's really important. I can't tell you the number of programs I found commissioned by Vince Cable that I had to get rid of, right? But there are those programs in every department, and we need to do that. We didn't do it when I first became Chancellor because our priority was the no deal prep and preparing for an election. But now is the time to do it at this stage in the electoral cycle. And that way, I think you can find probably billions of savings.
Oh, that's interesting. So I should just say very quickly, if you're watching this, whether on the CPS website, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, please add questions to the chat on YouTube or CPS Twitter. I mean, Sajid and I will be talking, but I do want to give him your questions as well, which will be fed to us by the CPS team here. But one of the big tensions in terms of going for growth is to what extent we try to recreate the economy we've had, and to what extent we we accept that there is going to be dislocation and change, and to what extent we support people through that process. Now, the furlough scheme has been extremely successful. That comes to an end at the end of the month. I think about a third of firms are still using it, according to the latest statistics.
Yeah.
It's probably, it feels like it's time to end, but at the same time, the Treasury Select Committee has just come out and said that it should be kept going for the most vulnerable sectors like hospitality. Is that something you can sympathise with?
First of all, I'd say that the furlough scheme, when it was introduced, was absolutely the right thing to do. At that time in this crisis, it was early days, and no one knew, what the ultimate impact's going to be in terms of jobs, restructuring the economy. No one knew how long it might last, and it was right to try and protect those jobs. But that's what it was about. It's about protecting jobs. A job that's temporary, has a temporary impact. You can't do it. You go on furlough, but there's a job to come back to. And it was always understood, and Rishi made this clear, that it's a temporary thing. Because obviously over time there will be some structural changes, and sadly, some people will not have jobs to go back to. So, I very much agree with what Rishi has said so far, but it must end, and he set out a timetable, slowly ratcheting it down. I think that's the right approach, because if you continue with it, and even if it was a sort of sectoral way or paying a bit less and things like that, it's not fair on those people that are receiving the money from it, in the sense that you're sort of giving them false hope, possibly, that they've got a job to go back to when they might not have, and it's not fair on the taxpayer either, because when people don't have a job, they get other benefits and things, and this would be a lot higher than that. And I don't think it's generally fair on the taxpayer. And lastly, and very importantly as well, the economy will adjust, and there will be some sectors that we know already, sadly, whether it's travel, for example, some parts of the hospitality, there will be probably some more changes, maybe some of a permanent nature. And the quicker we allow that adjustment with suitable levels of support, the quicker our economy will recover.
So your recipe would be cutting taxes on jobs rather than protecting existing jobs?
You've got to create, we want to see an economy that's creating new jobs. Those people that are sadly losing their jobs, you want to see all of them get into work, and the best way to do that is have that dynamic economy. And if we keep, let's say, taxes higher than they need to be, or keep borrowing more than we need to, otherwise, then ultimately we're going to hit the growth in the economy, and that's not going to help anyone who finds himself out of a job.
Now, one of the potential obstacles to growth is of course, the uncertainty around Brexit, which is flourished back into life in the past week or so. I mean, where are you on no deal, and is it a pinprick, in the context of coronavirus, or is it still a real challenge? And also, what's your take on the internal market bill, which has proved controversial in several areas?
Yeah, I thought you might ask me that. Look, first of all, on the Brexit talks and getting a deal, I absolutely want to see a trade deal. I think we all do. The government certainly does, and I think also, by the way, despite everything in the last few days, I still think there's a decent chance that we'll get a deal. And I know it's sort of getting to the closing stages, and we're seeing a lot of sort of ratcheting it up, as it were, of the public discussion around this, but that's sort of to be expected now. And I still think we can land a deal here, a trade deal, which is in everyone's interest. If we don't get a deal, obviously, in terms of no deal, it's not something that anyone would wish for, but we can, just as I thought before, in last year, now we can deal with that. We'll come through it, and the next day we'll be back at the table with our European friends and trying to discuss a deal. So one way or another, we'll eventually probably end up with a deal. But ideally, you don't have to go through no deal first. But if it happens, I'm not afraid of it. We just need to sort of get on with this and try to secure that deal. In terms of the internal markets bill, I think the bill itself, but I know obviously why you've asked, but in terms of the core of the bill, which is making sure that these powers that were previously with the EU in terms of our market competition and such, that they are held at the centre in Westminster, so that we don't take a risk that our own internal market in the United Kingdom is fractured in any way. I think that's the right principle, and I support that. In terms of this whole debate we're seeing at the moment about breaking international law, I think that no government should think that's something that's you take that lightly, that is easy to do. And I can understand why a number of people have raised concerns about it. And it's something that I'm going to have to look at, and I will do at the weekend, and think about it more carefully.
Just have you imagined what it would have been like to be a cabinet secretary? So not cabinet secretary, a cabinet minister, reading out an admission that what you were proposing broke the law, even in specific and limited circumstances.
Well,
extraordinary kind of.
Yeah, of course. When I heard Brandon say what he said in Parliament this week, of course, you do think about how you would have felt if you were a Secretary of State and being told that. And that's why, look, this is a very serious step if we go ahead as a country, and therefore it deserves serious consideration. The bill's only just been published. It is a sort of big, detailed, complex bill, and I would think any sort of straight-thinking parliamentarian would want to have a very close look at it over the weekend.
So one of the aspects of the Brexit debate is around state aid. So this is something I feel quite strongly about. I think, in the 1970s, Tony Benn came out, and I've written about this in my Sunday Times this week, or I will be writing. Publishing deadlines being what they are. In the 1970s, Tony Benn's reason for leaving the European Union was so that in the alternative economic strategy he put forward, was so that the state could assume greater control of the economy. We now seem to be presented with a 21st century version of this, in which one of the justifications given for failing to agree state aid rules is because apparently state aid rules are crucial to creating British Googles, Amazons and Facebooks, which, by the way, is something that no one involved in the tech sector has ever told me is a crucial component of why we don't have British Amazons, Google and Facebooks. I suspect we are in a violent agreement on this one. But the Internal Markets Bill contains quite extraordinary provisions for the government to essentially hand funds to whoever and whatever it thinks will promote economic development, irrespective of, sort of whatever anyone else says. Is this something? This isn't conservatism, is it?
Well, the state aid system that we had within the EU was actually a pretty robust, detailed system that, when properly applied, and by the way, there were other countries, the number of times I came across, that would break them, some too often. But the rules themselves, a set of rules to try and make governments think twice and very carefully about some kind of public subsidy. And I think it's right that government should be very, very hesitant to get involved themselves in supporting private enterprises. And I was confronted with this challenge all the time as a minister and as business secretary in the steel sector, for example, more recently with Flybe and others, just before the pandemic. And I think for a government to provide a public subsidy, there needs to be a very, very, very good reason. Some kind of obvious market failure, some long-term interest, maybe a national security interest or something. Now, we don't know what the final set of rules are going to be, because although this bill has been published, what the business secretary has said, Alok, that there'll be a consultation on what the rules would look like, and so I don't want to prejudge that, but I think these principles of the state staying out of business generally, unless there's a very good excuse, are good, sound ones. Otherwise, if what you'll have is a situation like we had in the 70s, where it won't be governments picking winners, it will be losers picking off the government.
But I've had conversations with people who are investors in this country on a very sort of large scale, who are saying, look, they want to raise CGT, they want to raise corporation tax, they're planning to, they're apparently going to sort of start intervening in the economy, and then we've got the COVID, and then we've got the, what justification can I give people in my company or people I talk to for putting their money in Britain as opposed to other countries? And one of the great successes of the Conservatives since 2010 is making Britain a really attractive place for international investment. And it seems like we're turning away from that.
No, I wouldn't, Rob, I wouldn't quite agree with that. I think we can give a lot of justification. I mean, obviously, look, we're in an economic crisis, but you find me a major economy that is not in an economic crisis right now. And investors, obviously, they understand that. But as the UK over at least a couple of decades now, and even under the previous Labour government, we in the early days of that government, at least, we were still attracting a lot of foreign investment and building new businesses, creating jobs, especially in the last 10 years. We've seen a record job creation, and we are still one of the most dynamic, welcoming to business societies out there. Now, you mentioned a few things there. You said people have said to you about raising CGT or corporation, but no one's done that yet. I know there's speculation out there, but I can tell you that the number of times that whether it's Chancellor or other departments, that there'd be all sorts of speculation about what I'm going to do. All that matters is what really happens at the end of the day. And I think the government understands this, and certainly Rishi and his team really do. To be a successful economy, to keep growing, we need to again stick to those principles I talked about right at the start, which includes supporting free enterprise, keeping taxes low, having sensible regulation, and sound finances.
And on the specifics, you unlike Nigel Lawson and possibly Rishi, are not persuaded by the case for equalising taxes on capital and income.
I'm not persuaded by that now.
Fair enough. So let's move on to audience questions. And one is a slightly cynical question, but I can see the appeal of it. I mean, why, if you're in the Treasury, as I said, these are actually two questions which I've sort of combined into one. Why isn't the temptation to just engage in a bit of fiscal repression, let inflation loose, let tax thresholds sort of drift gently upwards, just try and basically make people bear the cost without them realising they're bearing the cost?
Look, tax threshold. First of all, tax thresholds generally go up in any case, and it's actually the law on a whole bunch of taxes, and so that's nothing new. But you made the point about inflation, and I don't think that the right answer, as it were, is to let inflation rip in this case. We've been, one of the reasons we've been so successful economically in recent times is because we do take inflation seriously, and making the Bank of England independent was absolutely the right thing to do back in 97. That said, though, I do think there is a case to look again at the mandate of the Independent Bank of England, and that is this inflation mandate. And that is to consider nominal GDP targeting, something I actually talked about in the paper.
It was going to be my next question, so I'm glad.
Yeah. And the reason for that is that, look, this mandate was set a couple of decades ago. The world's moved on. That doesn't mean the world's moved on in a way that inflation is unimportant. Of course not. But I think there is a strong case for a broader mandate where the Bank of England is thinking about the overall economic activity, the size of the economy, and we accept that sometimes there can be situations where if you're just religiously targeting inflation, that inflation might sort of pop up or down, but for reasons that are not directly associated with the broader economic activity. It can be a big spike in some certain import prices or something might spike your inflation, but you might actually still need to keep interest rates lower than otherwise to support the economy. So I think we should look at that. We shouldn't take it lightly. You know, if you are going to change the mandate of the Bank of England, it needs to be properly debated and consulted and thought through. But we have, you know, when we made the Bank of England independent, we've been leaders, thought leaders in this. I think we can do it again. And considering, my final point is that knowing that over the coming years, sadly, that we're likely to see much more unemployment, you know, having a mandate that broadly sort of takes into account the economic activity, I think can help with that as well.
And another question, which you slightly touched on already, but what from the Tory manifesto was obviously a fantastic document. You know, I helped write it on it. But obviously circumstances have now changed. What are the things in it? I mean, the fiscal rules, obviously, but what are the things in which you would now say, look, force majeure, we're going to have to drop these? And I'm thinking particularly of the tax lock on income tax, VAT and national insurance, but also, for example, the triple lock on pensions.
No, I think we should be very, very hesitant to drop anything from not those two very specific things that you've mentioned there. And I can understand the debate that's going on amongst them. First, I think I've already talked about taxes, and I, you know, I certainly would want to see an increase in any of those three major taxes for the reason I've talked about earlier about derailing the recovery. And in terms of the triple lock on pensions, and again, I can absolutely see, because of the crisis, why you could see a sort of, let's say, a technical increase in a single year in earnings, which it could lead to a considerable increase in cost. I can see that. I think the Treasury's, if it's true, is right to sort of work out those numbers and see what it would look like. But I just think if you then step back and start breaking these promises, then there are other your price you'll have to pay is that your people will have to know when they can trust you and why should they believe your word in the future. I just think you just need to think carefully about this. So I would just be a bit hesitant.
And in terms of a question from Chris Harding, which is, you know, this conference is about growth, but at the core of growth is productivity, and we are really very bad indeed. And, you know, so what would you be doing? What would you be doing on that? How would you be getting the UK up the league table, which would of course give us all a lot more money to spend?
Yeah. Well, look, it's another great question, because even before this pandemic, we've had a long-running productivity problem for many years, especially since the last financial crisis. And you know, pre-crisis, our productivity was, you know, I think something like 20% below the G7 average. And clearly, there's nothing to be proud of. And one of the reasons is that, you know, I mentioned a couple of things before. I think one of the key things is infrastructure. You know, we've got lousy infrastructure in large parts of the country. We need to upgrade it, modernize it. You know, we haven't built a major rail line north of London for like over 100 years. You know, so we really need to modernize infrastructure. I think that will help with productivity. And not just between the big cities, but between the towns.
I know the answer, we discussed it, but you are a fan of HS2.
I support HS2, yes. I support it as Chancellor, and I continue to do so. The other thing I think is, it gives me an opportunity to mention that I do think it's absolutely critical is skills, you know, investing in skills. And you know, when I was at the Treasury and we did an analysis of you know, earnings, average earnings in different regions, it was no surprise to find that the biggest sort of correlation is with the level of skills. And what we also find is that, you know, the lots of people, you know, will go to sort of, you know, they might be from areas of low income, but go to great universities and things, and in that area, and but they leave and they go to the southeast afterwards and stuff. Still, so depressing earnings locally. So we've got to invest more in skills, and I think that we do need a long-term, what I'd call a long-term plan for skills. And that is not just about the education department. It has to be a whole of government effort. That's what it requires between the Treasury, between DFE, between the DWP. In fact, every government department's got a role to play in that, because it's human talent that we need to invest in. And for too long, I just think we've been a bit obsessed with academic ability and universities, when we should also be thinking just as much about colleges and that kind of vocational education. It's something I supported a lot as Chancellor, as Business Secretary, and I hope we continue to do that.
That actually leads me on to a question from one G. Osborne, which he asked rhetorically in the previous session.
Who's he?
What is the is the government ambitious enough on education and welfare? He was saying, look, they've got all these grand schemes, but what's their offering on the core public services? And actually, I'd add on that social care. I mean, what do you think? What do you think the answer is there? Because obviously we need a plan on it. So what should that look like?
Yeah, look, on social care, we need to, the government, the MPs, broadly, we need to decide on what kind of long-term social care offering that we want, settle on that, and that's why the Prime Minister in the past has talked often, rightly, I think, about trying to get a cross-party agreement, if at all it can be achieved, a bit like we sort of got with the NHS, and then find out the long-term way how to fund that. But accept that if people want the government to offer a lot more social care, it will have to be paid for, and it's not going to come easily out of the current finances. So there will have to be a way found to pay for that. I don't know what that is yet, but I know the government's done work on that, and perhaps
is your sense that there should be people paying for it themselves, or that it'll have to come via?
I think as now there'll have to be some kind of. I think where you end up, there has to be some kind of sharing of the cost, and obviously the key question is to how is that split? But I think whatever system, if you look at other countries that have tackled this or tried to tackle this, Japan comes to mind, Germany as well. That it is still a risk-sharing system. It's not a system where the state pays for everything, and I don't think state paying for everything is the right answer. I just want to get back to, if I may, just on education as well, because you mentioned that there as well. We do need to be very, very ambitious on this, and I'm sorry I'm on about it again, but I do think this is just one of those areas where it will pay just huge dividends, not just for the obvious, like giving the better life chances to kids. I went to schools, state schools. Some were good, some not so good, but still, it was education that made the difference, gave me the opportunities. The reason I'm sitting in front of you now as a former chancellor, is because of the education I got, and we want as many people in our country to have those opportunities, and that does mean, I think, a long-term plan for skills. And by the way, the very last thing I'd want to see is another shutdown of the schools. I mean, that the impact on our children, 6 months of no schooling has been, I think, awful for so many kids in terms of their own chances, the impact on them, and it hasn't been even. Some kids have had access to online education and stuff, not ideal, but at least it's something. Others have had nothing, and so whatever happens next, we absolutely should not shut down the schools again.
I mean, you referred then to your own experience, and the fact. I mean, you and your family are one of the sort of the great adverts for British, for the power of aspiration and hard work in the UK. But you've also spoken, for example, in a recent interview with the Times about about the experience of growing up as with different coloured skin from most other people in Bristol, and particularly the statue of the slave owner Edward Colston. I mean, Colston. Sorry. Have you been? As the sort of Black Lives Matter movement has progressed, have you sort of changed your views on the race in the UK and how good we are at whether we are sort of paying enough attention to these issues?
I wouldn't say I've changed my views. I think what the recent protest demonstrations brought about is the concerns people have raised. The concerns have always certainly been there for me. I mean, that said, by the way, I think the UK is one of the most open, welcoming, tolerant countries in the world, and we are, I think, the most successful multiracial democracy in the world. But that said, we've still got our own challenges, and we see that in our prison system, disproportionately high number of black people. We see it sometimes we've seen incidents in policing in the past, and something I tackled as Home Secretary. So whenever we see instances of racism, obviously unacceptable in every way, we've got to make sure we crack down on it. But also, we need to, in all parts of society, I think we need to see as much diversity as possible. And some companies, when I think about the private sector again, some of them do a great job in doing that. Others haven't taken it seriously enough. But, broadly, we've got a lot to be proud of, but we can definitely do more.
And the other sort of protest movement recently is Extinction Rebellion, and kind of caught the headlines. I mean, do you think? And again, this is something which came up a lot when we were harvesting questions. I mean, do you think the government's climate change plans are along the right lines? Are ambitious enough? And where should the group, where should the investment in green tech and green infrastructure go to?
I think I voted like so many MPs for net zero, and that was on my part. It was a serious commitment. In the Treasury, we started the work of setting out how we can meet that commitment to eventually getting to net zero. And even though it's decades away, it's not going to be easy, and it's going to cost. There is a cost to that, and I do think sometimes that, in Parliament, that, voting to do something that's not going to happen for a long, long time is the easy thing. I mean, what's not to like about that, right? The hard bit is
virtue signalling via legislation.
Yeah, I mean, anyone can do that, right? Now we've got to actually do the hard work, and there will have to be some big decisions made. Now, even during my time in the Treasury, I started the sort of some of the work towards that with support for electric vehicles and research and development in that area and other renewables. And we are just going to have to go a lot further. And the cost of that, a large part of the cost that eventually will be on people either directly as consumers, if you want more insulation in your housing and things like that, someone's going to have to pay for it, and most of that will fall on the consumer. And even if the government does pay for it, and there's a case in certain areas where clearly it makes sense for the government to intervene, that's a cost for taxpayers. Now, obviously, there's a payoff. We all want a better, cleaner environment, but we should recognize that to get there is going to be a cost, and we all have to be willing to accept it.
Do you think we should look at carbon pricing, for example?
I think I'm not sure what model is the best one, but I think having a fresh look at carbon pricing and trying to sort of bring the market into helping you find the best and most efficient ways to reach your emission targets is a good idea.
And Dave Peterson asks on the topic of infrastructure, to what extent should investment power be devolved? I mean, we are notoriously one of the most centralised countries in the world, and perhaps one of the reasons that we've had sluggish growth has been that the central government has not been very good about knowing what's best for everyone in every region. Yeah,
look, I'm a big fan of devolution, and Dave, I think you mentioned, is right to ask about it. That we as a country, we are your power is too centralised. But then when you look around, about where if you were going to sort of disperse it, how you do that, you suddenly realise that our local government system is too fragmented. And we are the most centralised in terms of power of any G7 economy, easily. And we've paid an economic price for it, because it means that so many decisions are made in Westminster that would have been better made at a local, regional level, like on skills and certain types of infrastructure. I think since we've had the mayoral combined authorities, it's been a success. I created most of those mayoral combined authorities when I was local government secretary. And I remember people, including in my own party, saying, what are you doing? Sajid, you'll never get a Conservative elected in the West Midlands. You'll never get a Conservative up in the North East or anything. And look what we have. We've got some fantastic Conservative mayors around the country, in Ben and Andy and others. And they've done a huge transfer. Look what Ben and Andy have achieved in their patches, particularly some of the successes really that Ben has had up in the Northeast. So I'm a big fan of devolution. I'd like to see more of it. I know the government is planning to bring forward more proposals. And by the way, while we're on it, because I think it's related, is more unitaries as well. You know, our local council system is just too fragmented. And when it comes to, you know, key decisions locally on things like transport, planning, we just need to be much more joined up, and we'll save some money in doing that as well. So,
I mean, you obviously didn't leave government by choice, or you left by choice, but in the face of, because you were asked to make a decision by the Prime Minister that you didn't feel you could live with. Are you glad that you're seeing what's happened since? Is there a part of you that's quite glad that you've been free of the carnage?
I wouldn't put it like that. No, not really. Look, obviously, I wouldn't change anything. Looking back in terms of my own decisions. But I will say, certainly in the early sort of weeks of leaving government, and it sort of coincided very quickly with the lockdown happening and things, it was a big change for me, for being in government and making all those decisions to suddenly being at home like everyone else during the lockdown, and outside of government, watching my colleagues on TV and listening to them on radio and things, and making these tough and really dealing with these challenging decisions, while I was sitting at home, thinking about, what we're having for dinner and who's making it.
I mean, that's one question that's just come up. I mean, do you think? Sorry, I'm just looking at my question. I mean, do you think the government's been right to sort of push people to go back to the office, or should we be sort of accepting it's not going to happen and trying to adapt accordingly?
I think that first of all, the government is right to, as it has been, trying to give people more confidence to get out and about, and so. Whether that was the Eat Out, Help Out scheme or messaging and things, I think it is right that in a COVID sort of cure way to sort of say, look, you can use public transport, you can go to your offices, don't be afraid. That said, we also at the same time have to accept that there will be, as a result of the crisis, is probably in certain areas and sectors accelerated a change that was probably taking place anyway, where people, there are some people, even after we're past the worst of this crisis, that they will choose to work from home, and their employers will be quite happy for them to work at home. And obviously we can sort of fight that. We should recognise that's just a real sort of permanent change.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and rattle through a few. Sort of
go for it.
If you went back into government, what would be what job that you've already done or that you would want to do?
What job haven't I done?
Let's assume that Rishi is not going to step aside. But is there something that you'd really want to do that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Look, Rob, I haven't really thought about that. I haven't been thinking about going back into government. It's not something that occupies my time. I think about how I can help. And doing this report with the CPS and some of the other work I'm doing on social projects is the way I intend to make my contribution for now.
Fair enough. Another question: should we raise? Is it finally time to raise fuel duty? And if you were sitting in the Treasury, how do you deal with the fact that people are just going to stop driving fossil, cars with fossil fuel, and how do you fill that revenue gap?
No, I don't think it's time to raise it, and the longer term challenge that you put out there is something actually already in the Treasury. There's been sort of work done about how you might try to replace that. I'm not gonna talk about that, say too much about that now. But your central question about is now the time to raise fuel duty? I just think you just risk derailing recovery.
And a more sweeping question. I mean, if there was in this, again, to plug this magnificent report, which has
great report,
60 different proposals in it. How many pages is it? 75 pages. What from this or elsewhere is the one thing? Like, if you wanted to, I'm sorry, this was from an anonymous attendee, so I don't have the name. But what is the single most useful thing we could do to deliver growth?
Well, look, I would say this, having helped write the report, I think there's a lot of good things, but if you're saying that highlight one in particular that, let me put it this way, without, I'll mention one, and without it, I just don't think you're going to get recovery, and that is the infrastructure investment. The uptick, the huge uptick in infrastructure investment, and the delivery of how we do it, and obviously the type of infrastructure, the economic infrastructure we invest in, but broadly, infrastructure is going to be absolutely key for the next, at least the next decade, to our recovery.
And the question, this is actually a question from me. There have been lots of rumours. I mean, James Forsyth's column today sums it up quite well. You know, the Tory backbenchers are not in a sort of restive state in various directions. I mean, are you worried that the party's not going to have the stomach to do some of the tough stuff that will be required? On housing, for example, I mean, you and I are both evangelical about the need for house building, but in our last session we had Bob Seeley, your parliamentary colleague, who claimed that levelling up is turning into concreting over, and was extremely damning of the government's ambitions on this. I mean, do you think that and on other issues, you know, I mean, on Brexit as well, you know, where are the kind of pinch points, and how strong is the
I think in any government, regardless of the size of your majority, you will always have you know, some things will come up that, and this has been my experience, that you know, some people are going to have qualms about and be very uncomfortable with, and they may even go as far as not supporting it. But your question was, do I think that's going to be a problem for this government? I don't. You know, the majority is a decent majority, the biggest Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher's time. The broad sort of commitment that exists for levelling up, spreading opportunities, growth and things is there in everyone. And when it comes to specifics, and you mentioned a good one, housing, you know, the need to change planning, some of the planning rules and things. Look, we need more homes, right? We need more homes in the right places. Your house prices in this country are the highest of any G20 economy in terms of earnings. The average house price 8 times earnings. And it is the biggest barrier, in my mind, to social progress in our country today. People who just can't afford and own a decent home. And we should, as Conservatives, be supporting people to buy their own home. And that does mean you need to build more homes, and they need to be in the right places. There's no point in building these homes where no one wants to live. We've tried that. It doesn't work. And there's no getting around that. And when I was the housing secretary, I made a whole set of changes. And even with those changes, you know, it's led to...
Which by the way, Theresa May then refused to... You know,
well, no, there was a set I wanted to make. I did have to water them down, but I still, you know, made a bunch of changes.
And house building rose accordingly.
And yeah, and we've got the highest level of house building we've seen in 30 years. It's still not enough. But my point was going to be, I had a number of colleagues at the time that were a bit concerned, and I absolutely understood that, you know, and it's right that they raised their concerns. But I can find from my own experience, you sit down with colleagues, you take them through it, you help them explain it and communicate it, show them what the local benefits would be as well. You can carry a lot of them with you. And that's why I think on the housing reforms that we need, that we can get them through. We just got to stick with it.
And another area where there's sort of some dispute within the party is on free trade. So let me just, given the Japan deal out today, what does the, so hooray, a free trade deal. What does the UK's trading future look like? Can we expect swashbuckling free trade, or will the protectionists win?
Look, I expect lots more free trade, right? And that's one of the freedoms we've got. We've got many, but one of the freedoms from leaving the EU is that we can have our own free trade agreements that work for Britain. And that's been amply demonstrated today by Liz Truss and her team in signing this Japan agreement. You know, a lot of people said we wouldn't get it, or we wouldn't get it in time. But I'll tell you what they also said is they said you wouldn't be able to get any improvements on what the EU already had, and that is not the case. This trade that Liz and her team have agreed is much better for the UK. than what we had with the EU, and that's what I'd like to see continue. And by the way, this trade, as I understand it, I think it also opens up it's a big step for us towards the CPTPP, which is a Trans-Pacific trade. I hope I got that acronym right. And that is, if it opens the door to that, then it's going to be an even bigger win, and it does demonstrate that we can do it. And I think it demonstrates the government is serious about free trade.
Well, let's hope you're right. I think various vested interests are also serious about blocking free trade, and we'll see who wins on that one. One final question, which combines two questions, one of which is from Ronald Lehman, who says, young people are understandably worried about their employability. You've lived through recessionary and difficult times. What hope and encouragement can you offer those who need it? And the other question was a simpler one on similar things like, what are the things that make you hopeful about the economy and about Britain's future and growth prospects?
Okay, I think just turning to the first question about young people. Look, obviously, I've got 4 kids of my own. A couple of them are at university. They eventually will be in the job market, and I know that they and their friends they think about what the future might hold, especially in light of this crisis we've seen.
Can I just ask, were they affected by the Ofqual?
No, they were not. No, they were not.
So you were.
Yeah, we dodged that one in terms of the year groups that they were in. I can understand where that question comes from, and look, young people have a huge amount to be hopeful for. That we, as long as we stick to those principles, and it goes right back to the start of our conversation today, that have proved their work for Britain and led to growth and job creation. So sticking with free enterprise and backing risk takers and keeping taxes low and things, we will keep having that dynamic economy that's going to create jobs everywhere. The other big thing is the investment in skills I've talked about. We've increased investment in skills. There's more to do, especially apprenticeships, and there's vocational skills and colleges and things, but we need to keep down that track. And as I said, I think we need this long-term plan for skills as well. And then also it allows me again just to mention the importance of sound public finances again, because it is always just worth remembering that what we borrow today is a deferred tax rise. What we borrow today, someone is going to have to pay it off. And in large part, it will be the next generation. So we're borrowing record amounts now to help us get through this crisis. And it's right under the circumstances to do that, but up to a point. But if we keep borrowing excessively for day-to-day consumption, once we sort of got past the worst of this crisis, then it's our children that are going to have to pay for it. And that is both economically wrong, because it will mean there's just less money to spend on opportunities for them. And it's morally wrong as well, because they're going to have to pay for their own consumption, let alone what we consumed, but passing on the bill. And
of course, the aging population means there will be fewer of them.
So we should always remember that with taxes, someone's got to pay with debt. By the way, someone's got to pay, and it's often going to be your children, your grandchildren. And life is hard enough as it is. We don't need to give them that extra burden.
Sajid, thank you very much for that, and thank you all for watching and for your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't quite get to all of them, but I think we got through a fair chunk. We'll now take another 10-minute break, so please go and get a sandwich or a cup of tea, and we'll be back with sessions on the effect of regulation on the economy, a big focus of our work on the CPS. After that, at 5 to 3, I'll be leading a panel, 5 past 3, I'll be leading a panel of the leading think tankers in the country, the heads of some of the lesser but still leading think tanks in the country, and we'll be debating different approaches to growth. And then our final panel of the day will be on how we not just drive growth but spread it more equally, and how we can ensure that the recovery really does work for everyone, as somebody always used to say. But thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much.
Thanks again. Thanks for having me. Thank you.